Why did you enlist?
Had something to prove to my father, I guess. He was in well, just before World War II broke out, he was in the university getting, he had a master's degree and he was working on a law degree. And prior to Germany overrunning Poland, they pulled everybody out of the university and made them all soldiers.
Huh.
So he had a horse, he had a big sword and so on. And when Germany attacked, they countered on horseback. Well, it only took 3 weeks for them to defeat Germany. I'm sorry, defeat Poland.
Poland, yeah.
And he spent from 39 until 45 in a POW camp.
Dad was in Poland when Germany invaded. He's on horseback, so you hear about this. Do I have that right? So, I mean,
Yeah,
we hear about this, that the Poles are on horseback while the German blitzkrieg is coming in. And he spends 5 years as a prisoner of war.
yeah.
And in February 1970, you enlist in the army, and you said you felt that you had something to prove to your dad. So what was that?
Well, I always considered him tough.
Mm,
You know, we're actually, he told me he got wounded twice, but it was in the camps while he was a POW. And he would tell me these stories, and I wanted to prove that I was as tough as he was, and
mm.
I could manage and get through a war like he did, and hopefully not become a POW. I knew that if I went into the Army, I would go to Vietnam, especially as infantry. Uh, I uh, I thought I would become a clerk because I could type 80 words a minute at that time.
Mm.
And I passed their tests and all, but since I didn't sign up for 4 years, I ended up in the infantry like most everybody that went into service during that time.
Wow. So you enlist in the army in February 1970, and when did you actually arrive in South Vietnam?
August 4th.
August. And where did you fly in? Did you fly into Tan Son Nhut or
Well,
Benoit?
we landed in Tan Son Nhut, where they bussed us to Benoit, spent about 3-4 days at the 90th Replacement Center, and then got helicoptered to Cu Chi Base Camp, where I was assigned to the 1st Wolfhounds of the 25th Division.
You fly out of the States, and then I think you said Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and then South Vietnam. And one of the things I wonder is, that first leg, is there a certain vibe on the plane? And then as you're getting closer and closer to South Vietnam, does the vibe on the plane kind of change? As these guys you're with, I'm imagining the great majority, this is their first tour, so they really don't know what's coming. I'm just wondering what the feeling was like on the plane.
Most of the trip through the Philippines was kind of jovial. Everybody was on a great adventure.
Mm,
A lot of bullshitting going on the plane, card games. Everybody was kind of jovial, but once we left the Philippines, it was, oh, this is it. You know, we were anticipating getting ambushed or hit by rockets when the plane landed.
mm,
A lot of us couldn't fathom that we were going in a commercial jet instead of taking some kind of a military transport, that would take us into Benoit. But leaving the Philippines and being on a Pan American jet, it was kind of like, uh-oh, you know, we were warned all through basic training in AIT that you were going to die in Vietnam. So that was pushed through our heads all the time through training. So get it through your heads, you're going there to die. Once you landed there, it was entirely different, and it was beyond our expectations because landing in Tansanut, there are people walking around just like a civilian airport. People were dressed in civilian clothes. Soldiers didn't carry weapons. There was a bunch of jets taken off, helicopters taken off, a lot of activity there, but it didn't seem like a war was going on.
Do you have any recollections at all of the flight attendants on the Pan Am flight?
Well, they were all gorgeous for
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
but beyond that, it was they were very, I can't think of the word, but very supportive and sad in that last leg, because they were wondering, how many of these kids are they going to see coming back? Because after they dropped us off, they were going to pick up those who were returning to the States. So on that last leg and then turning around to come back toward home, there was going to be two different visions that they saw. The naive kids going, and then the battle-hardened ones coming back with different looks and appearances.
How long was it before you saw something, heard something, experienced something that really drove the point home to that it was a war zone?
When I got to Kuchi,
Yeah.
all the time at the 90th Replacement Center, I was assigned a duty of guard of the massage parlor, and all the ladies, they slept on site there, but they gave me an M16 but no magazine. So it was just somebody standing there during the whole night. I don't know what good I would have done, if anybody wanted to come in
So
there, but
your first duty in Vietnam was guarding a massage parlor?
yeah, with no rounds, no, I had a nice weapon, but nothing to shoot. But yeah, that and everybody else, I had to turn it back in the morning to the armory, but there was no sign of anything. I mean, we had a enlisted men's club, and we had floor shows going on at the 90th Replacement Center.
Yeah.
There was a PX. It was just like any old town back in the States. Our fire base that I first went to was called Keene, and it was about 30 miles away from Kuchi toward the west. And anywhere in that area, the big mountain, Nui Ba Din, you could see it from any position. So that was one of the pronounced fixtures that you saw from Keene. And that was the place that patrols went out on. We would go out on 2-week to 4-week mission, and then come back to Keene for like a 3-day stand down, where we partied for 3 days and, recuperated. And then we went out for another 2 to 4 weeks. Around Keene, there was notorious areas of rubber plantations. There were 2 or 3 different major rubber plantations. We had different forests and woods that surrounded those areas, and a lot of little villages scattered about. Most of our time there, the local populace was under a curfew from 9 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. So if you saw anybody out there, during that time, they were considered enemy, and you could go ahead and take care of business. When we were in a place called the Iron Triangle, which we also operated in, that was considered a free fire zone. So 24 hours a day, if you ran across anybody, they were considered enemy soldiers.
Are you dealing overwhelmingly or strictly with Viet Cong in this area, or do you have some NVA down there as well?
We had a little bit of both. We didn't know it at the time, but pretty much the entire Viet Cong military structure was destroyed during Tet in '68. So a lot of the NVA who concentrated up north in I Corps or 2 Corps found their way down south in 3 and 4 Corps to beef up those VC units that were pretty much demolished. So in 3 Corps, we saw primarily VC, but there were NVA soldiers mixed in here and there. We had maybe 2 or 3 encounters where we were assigned to guard a bridge or guard a major thoroughway highway through the area, and the village kids primarily were attracted to us, and everybody was a beggar. You know, they would take your C rations, they love cigarettes, they love candy. In turn, they would sell you ice cold Coca-Cola, which was a special treat because everything that you drank out in the field was lukewarm. So to get an ice cold Coke, which cost you a dollar MPC, you'd have paid $10 for because it was just such a treat.
Wow.
But beyond that, the only other people we saw were workers in either the rice paddies or in the rubber plantations. And we hated coming across them out in that area because most of them had water buffaloes, and those water buffaloes hated Americans. I don't know what it was, but it could have been our scent. One night on a listening post, and this was in the Iron Triangle, there was myself and another guy sitting in a little ditch in the weeds, just observing. We were the first warning system if there was anybody, you know, nearby or so. Well, we accompanied an ambush force, which went out about another half a click beyond our position. And it was in the middle of the night. There was a group of 20 or so Viet Cong that happened to cross our path and decided to stop right there and take a lunch break. And you could smell them, a fish smell, and they made a special sauce. I can't pronounce it, but it's fermented fish. And between that and the sweat, you could smell them coming because they gave off a fish scent. And in times we've come across a couple, maybe 3 of them walking, and they're smoking a joint. So you could smell the marijuana predominantly in the air as they were coming. The flip side now, after being out in the jungle for 2 to 4 weeks, we would come back to the fire base. It first started on the helicopters because the pilots and the door gunners were sort of moved by our smell, that raunchy smell. And when we went into the fire base and walked through the front gate, everybody gave us a wide berth. And it was funny that to us walking into the fire base, you could smell palm olive soap and sort of like a cleanliness smell, which was kind of weird, you know. And then us spending three days in the fire base before going back out, you know, it was everybody showered up and cleaned up and so on. So we had that fresh smell going out into the jungle, you know, during the next mission. And it was always benefiting you to smell as rotten as the vegetation around you, so that you didn't give off that that additional odor.
Well, that's I wanted to ask you that. I mean, did you guys kind of conclude after a while, you know, a day before we're going to go back out, I'm not going to use palm olive soap, or I'm not going to use any kind of soap because that'll make it easier for the enemy to smell me? I mean, would you avoid using soap or
Oh,
shampoo
yeah.
or other smelly things so that when you go out the next day, the enemy will be less able to smell you coming?
Yep.
Wow, yeah,
And most of us had fresh fatigues on as well, because when we came back in,
yeah,
some of us may have worn those same fatigues for 4 weeks. And they were about ready to fall off or rot off or whatever have you. They all got burned, but we had freshly washed, clean fatigues that we were going out with. So, yeah, there was definitely something with a smell, and I could vouch for the fish scent. You had mentioned earlier too about that sense, fifth sense or whatever have you. Uh, Prior to walking into an ambush, we had with us a Kit Carson scout. And this Kit Carson scout was a former VC soldier who uh, surrendered and then went through special training and then was assigned to a special group of
right.
soldiers. Well, we had our own, and he saved us a few times because of things that he noticed prior to us walking into an ambush. Uh, he
So,
also saved us from walking into a base camp, which a lot of these enemy bunkers were so disguised you could stand next to one and didn't know you were there. And he would see that and he would pull everybody back uh, and make sure that he took care of you. Now, there were some talk of some of these Kit Carson scouts, once they got back out, they
yeah,
rejoined their former units and
yeah.
so on. So there was a trust factor involved there as well.
Did you feel throughout that you could trust the Kit Carson that was with you, with
I did.
your team?
I got along just right with him. Search and destroy is what they called it. We could walk up to 10 miles a day, and 3 Corps had heavy jungle, a lot of openness, like if you were working in the rubber plantations, the most famous being Michelin.
Mm,
These trees are perfectly spaced, uh, 20 feet apart, and there's no protection behind them. The tree's probably less than a foot in diameter. You couldn't hide behind a tree, and there was only ground cover. So everything was open for miles, and yet, when you walk through that area or an open area with elephant grass that came up 4 feet off the ground,
yeah,
uh, you would have snipers hiding in the jungle or at the edge of the rubber plantation, just ready to harass you or try to pick off some soldiers.
wow,
But down in 3 Corps, that was pretty much a favorable area for the tracks. So there was a lot of APCs, a lot of tanks that would join the infantry out on patrols through that area. And that was something I did not see up in I Corps because of the mountains.
all right, sure, yeah. Sometimes veterans who see a lot of combat in the course of a year, or for the Marines, 13 months in Vietnam, sometimes they'll say they have a good memory of the first fight. And then after that, things, other than, maybe specific events they remember, but other than that, things kind of jumble together. Is that true for you? I mean, do you have a really strong memory of the very first firefight you were involved in? And then after that, they kind of get all jumbled together in your mind, or how does that work for you?
Every firefight was scary,
Mm,
but I agree with you that first one, everybody remembers their first one. Uh, Personally, this was one thing that I want to bring up is that we were all noted as FNGs, were FN new guys, or in my case, cherries.
yeah,
And these newbies were untrusted. They had to gain the trust of their fellow soldiers. They had to uh, show that they could protect them as and not become a liability like most of them did. And a firefight was when you got your cherry busted, so to speak, and you were witness to sounds that you never heard of. You were witness to sights that you never saw, probably maybe never see again. But that was a turning point in all the soldiers, because it was something they were going to remember for the rest of their life. In my case, we're getting shot at and people are returning fire. I had my rifle caught in some roots and I was helpless. As I tried to undo it, I'd have rounds landing near me. I couldn't see a person. People were shooting, and when I asked, where you're shooting at, they're just shooting, because you couldn't see your enemy. But I
You're
was
shooting toward the sound of the AK that's coming, or
yeah,
whatever else. Yeah.
but I was so afraid at that point and so helpless that I peed my pants.
Mm.
And nobody laughed at you. It was kind of like, hey, well, it happened to me too, kind of thing. But beyond that, the next ones, they were there, they happened, and it's no big deal. You don't even remember them in most instances, but that first one will be a standout.
Now, was it an M16 you had that got caught in the roots?
Yeah.
So how did that happen? Did you just, jerk real quick and somehow got caught in the roots, and because you just swung it
Well,
around real quickly or something?
everybody dropped,
Oh,
and you wanted to face this direction of the firing, and it just so happened that that area that I chose to fall in was uprooted trees and such in that area. Might have fell over from bombs or those things in the past years, but
yeah.
it once the firing starts, you don't try to pick and choose a place to jump to. You just drop in place, and where you are.
Yeah. And just in the process of that, your rifle got caught. And how long did it take you before you were able to get it free?
God, it seemed like forever, but probably just a minute or so.
One of the things that comes up in what I've written, or what I've read of what you've written, is calculating body count, because we may not have a body, but we have a blood trail, that sort of thing. How did that work? Of course, body count is a big part of the metrics that are used to determine, how things are going. So if you've got a body, you've got a body. That's pretty straightforward. But in other cases, how did that work for getting body count?
The enemy soldier was notorious for pulling bodies out of the battlefield. And majority of the time after a firefight, we never did find a body. Yes, there were blood trails. A rule of thumb was if someone was severely wounded, there would be a lot of blood forming this trail away, and then the blood would thin out. Well, you may consider that a body, because there was no way that person could survive with as much blood as you've seen. If you found a body part, that would also be another body, because sometimes you did come across parts. But they were inflated. A lot of the officers, when they called in afterwards, if you had 2, 3, or 4 bodies, they might have inflated it to 8. We had competition between platoons and between companies as to who would get the most body counts within a certain period of time. And these were listed outside of the main admin center.
Hmm.
at the fire base. So everybody knew how many platoons, who's in the lead, who's behind, and so forth.
Really.
Back in the States during training, they drummed through your head that you were going there to stop communism. Because communism, if the domino effect occurred, could result in that entire area coming under communism, and it could come to leach into the United States. So actually we were there to prevent that from happening. Now, once you went out in the jungle and you spend time with these same 20 or 30 guys, time and time and time again, it got to the point where, wait a minute, communism isn't as important as it is to support one another, and you did whatever it took to protect yourself and the guy next to you. And from that point on, after the firefight, it's kind of like, hey, I just want to get back home, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure that happens to me and to Jim and to Joe and Billy Ray and all the rest of them who are there with you.
How would you describe the Viet Cong and the NVA that you're dealing with? And I guess here we could speak about 3 Corps and I Corps, and but keeping them separate, sort of the Viet Cong and the NVA. How would you describe them as adversaries? How are they similar? How are they different?
Well, in similarity, they both wanted to kill you.
Yeah.
Separately, the VC were, in most instances, peasants. They just want to get in and join the fight, and for freedom and whatever whatever they were chasing. They were poorly supplied. Most of them had weapons from World War II. They were smart though, because they didn't take on more than they could chew. So they pick and chose their fights. In most cases, they would snipe at a unit and take off, going into one of their tunnels or whatever have you, because they got to know both groups got to know how the soldiers would react after a firefight. That artillery would be called, or a helicopter would come in and fire up the area. So in most cases, the VC, they spent a couple minutes sniping at you and then they took off. The NVA now, these are in the same class as the American soldiers because they went through training. They're highly effective. They followed orders. I mean, if there were 10 of them that were going to attack this unit of 100, so be it. They would dig in and they would fight you to the last man. Unlike the VC, they wouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the NVA, we were fighting the same kind of soldiers that we were.
So as you're speaking about the NVA, now of course you respect the VC and the NVA in that, their bullets are equally lethal. But it sounds like you had respect for the NVA as not just as folks who have bullets that are lethal, but as folks who are, well-trained, serious soldiers.
Exactly.
So you're in Cu Chi for 8 months, and then you go to Phu in I Corps, south of Hue a bit. What was the reason for that move from 3 Corps to I Corps?
Well, at that point, the 25th was taking their colors and returning to Hawaii, leaving the war. Going back to that period in time, the last patrol, everybody knew the 25th was going home. So we all thought that, hey, we're all leaving, and this last patrol that we're on, nobody wanted to be the last one killed in Vietnam. So you had a bunch of paranoid soldiers that were extremely cautious, sometimes way to the right of where they should be. But they made a deadline that if you had 10 months in country, you could return to Hawaii with the unit. If not, you got removed and transferred to other units where needed. So I had 8 months in country. I got transferred to the 101st. A couple friends of mine got transferred to the Miracal. Ended up in Firebase Marianne, and Marianne got overrun. So that was a hell of an initiation for them into the 23rd Division. Fubai, where I went, was kind of like the Kuchi of the North for the 101st. That was the rear area, probably one of the more secure areas. And from there were various fire bases, fire support bases that we went out to. And after spending 2-3 days at Fubai, I was assigned to my unit and sent out to the field where, well, actually what had happened in that case, they were coming back to the base camp for a 3-day stand down. And at that particular time, coming up to the 101st, when we were down south, everything that we read and heard was that the 101st was really getting beat up bad. They were losing a lot of soldiers. Every time they went out, they got into a fight. You had their Hamburger Hill, you had Dak To, you had all these other places where they really got beat up bad. And when I got up there, I really didn't want to be in the infantry anymore. And I went so far as to see a recruiting officer to rejoin for another 4 years just to get out of the field.
So you would re-enlist in exchange for a rear job.
Yeah, something to get me out of the field, because I knew the 101st, if we went out, man, that our ticket was going to be pulled, and that was it. Yeah. One of the first sergeants of my unit then took me to the side. He says, "Hey, you know, we have rocket attacks here daily. We have mortars. We have this and this and this. There's really no safe area here. And in fact, there's units out in the field that haven't fired their weapon in months. You know, so why do something that you're going to regret later in life?" And he convinced me to go ahead and stay. And since I was a radio operator for the last 4 months down south, his company command platoon, which was the captain and several radio operators who kept in touch with the rear areas and medevacs and artillery and so on. One of those guys was going home, and he would go ahead and vouch for me to take his place
as the radio operator.
As a radio operator with the command platoon. Being part of the command platoon, you went out on patrols, but on the squad size patrols, you didn't. You stayed within a small defensive perimeter with the rest of the company, and you didn't have to do those things. So in my case, this was going to be a gravy job compared to what I had, and I agreed to stay, and he made it happen. So I went out on my first patrol with them as their radio operator. Down south, when I carried the radio, I was the lieutenant's RTO, and he went out on these squad-sized patrols. So wherever he went, I had to go. When I went up north, as part of that, it really became a plus for me. Not only as an RTO for the captain, but I was privy to everything going on everywhere. I had to keep track of all the different platoons, what they were doing, what the squads were doing, report all this activity to the captain to keep him abreast of everything. It was my job to call in medevacs. There was another guy there with us that would call in artillery, but we knew exactly what was going on with each of the platoons and such, where I wasn't privy to that down south.
Now, so you experienced a lot of firefights, ambushes down in 3 Corps. How about in I Corps? So comparatively, it's a safer job. Did you find yourself in firefight situations up there as well?
We did. It was mostly mortars and rockets, than ambushes. We would up there. We ran across a lot of trail watchers, and as we were moving from one area to another, we may spot one, or for sure we were under observation wherever we went. So wherever we set up for the night, we were sure to get mortared or probed, or something would happen. So yeah, while out in the field, it wasn't any more, it wasn't any less of what happened down south. But in most cases, it took probably a couple months before I fired my weapon for the first time. It would take us, in some instances, 3 days to get to the top of a mountain that we were going up. And that meant sleeping on a slope. It could be a 30-degree grade, and trying to sleep. We had guys roll downhill, so most of us had to tie ourselves to trees at night, so that would prevent us from, I mean, it was very uncomfortable, but it would prevent us from rolling downhill and losing our supplies or stuff of that nature. And then once you got up on top, you stayed there for maybe a day, and then you headed down into a valley, which was most of the time just elephant grass, short elephant grass that went over your head. You'd go through there and not being able to see anything in front of you because they're covered up as well. So then we'd start up another mountain, and get up to the top of that. Marching along or patrolling along with 70, 80 pounds on your back down south, that was all flatland. But in these mountains, Jesus, it was tough to pack all that stuff up and carry it up to the top of these mountains.
And I'm guessing, of course, in 3 Corps in the jungle, you've got the intense heat and humidity. Is one of the additional challenges you're dealing with in these mountains in I Corps that at night it actually gets really cold?
It does. You have a poncho liner. It's like if you live in Florida,
Yeah.
they have it could be 100 degrees during the day and it gets down to 60 at night. Well, 60 is freezing cold. Once you've endured 100% humidity and 100-degree heat, and then you've been sweating all day. So now at night you're trying to cool down and it gets down to 60 degrees. Yeah, it's freezing.
You arrive in South Vietnam in August 70, and so then you leave in August 71?
Correct.
In that year, could you, we know looking back that the American presence in South Vietnam is winding down, that troops are, the number of troops in South Vietnam is falling, and, increasingly wanting to hand things over to the South Vietnamese forces. Did you witness that yourself in that year? Did it feel like you were part of the wind down process?
Well, it happened with the 25th when they went home.
Right.
And I got sent up to the 101st. Now, what we were doing up in that area, and it's my understanding that within a year after I left, the 101st came back to the States. So they were deactivated. But what we were doing is from the DMZ southward, we were turning over fire bases to the ARVNs, so that they could stand up on their own 2 feet. The last almost last month Infantry, we took over a former Marine garrison base called Camp Books. And it was a gorgeous place. I mean, painted rocks and painted fences and so on. But after guarding and the Marines leaving and going home, we then had to turn this over to the Arvents, and then we moved south to another base. In the big picture, I didn't see it, and nobody could tell me that, hey, the Americans were leaving, the war was going to end, and so on. It was business as usual. You know, I didn't really know that, except for the 25th going home. That was it, you know. But there were still newbies arriving every day, you know, and if they were downshifting the war, why are these new soldiers continuing to arrive? I couldn't understand that. The majority of the Arvents in their bases, their families live with them, you know, so when they went out, they very seldom left that base, you know, and to say they're going out on patrol. We had a unit come out with us once, and it was kind of like, you know, pushing everybody, pushing the Americans out in front, you know, because, hey, you guys are the fighters, we're here to support you, but we don't want to be engaged, you know. And after the war, coming home, it kind of made that statement true when, after the American forces had left, North Vietnam invaded the South, and they came down throh Dak To and so on. And there was a picture that I recall seeing in the middle of the highway. There were thousands of boots and uniforms and rifles and sacks and everything that had been tossed and left behind as these Arvin soldiers fled south and camouflaged themselves to become farmers and everything else, so that they didn't have to fight the North Vietnamese. All in all, I didn't trust them. I had no empathy for them, and it was kind of like, hey, we're here doing their job, you know, and that's not fair. There's one dream that I continued to have over and over and over again over the years, and not so much, you know, during the last 10 years or so, but when I was with the 25th, after spending 4 or 5 months in country, you were kind of not afraid. You were a risk taker. You didn't do things by the book, so to speak. And myself and 2 other guys, we decided to go out on a patrol through this one open area and down a big long trail. Well, being 19-year-olds, we're ass grabbing and everything else going down a trail. And we got to a certain opening, and there was like a hitching post in the middle of the jungle. God knows what it was doing. There was no horses, there was no water buffaloes, but it was an actual hitching post that you would see outside a building out in a Western movie. And we decided to, at that point, turn around and go back. We had probably patrolled maybe a click and a half, 2 clicks. And we didn't see anything else. We came back. And the next morning, our entire platoon was going to go and investigate what this was. And we got halfway to the hitching post, and there was we got ambushed. And it happened to be that there was an enemy base camp off the trail. And the three of us were figuring, after the firefight the next day and a couple of guys got hurt, how were we able to go making the noise and grab assing like we did down that trail, past this base camp, and were unmolested, and then came back the other way? And the only thing we could think of was, as I said before, the VC choose their fights. And it was probably known that by our tactics, we were a scout outfit that was going out, and a bigger force would come, the next day or the day after. And that's exactly what happened.
That's what happened.
So I sort of blame myself that, hey, we caused the ambush, and it's my fault those guys got hurt. If we weren't so that we had to go out on this patrol, I don't know what we were trying to prove. It was kind of a boring day, and we just wanted to go out and do something, and get away from the day position that we were set at, and wondered why we did such a stupid ass thing, but that's something that bothered me for many years. I bring it up at the sessions that I used to go to, and I don't know, I'll never get over it. I mean, here we are 54 years later, and I'm still thinking about it.
How was the flight home for you? And here I'm just speaking kind of psychologically. How's the flight home different for you than or from the flight to South Vietnam?
We still had our fatigues on and whatever have you, and we boarded the plane, and everybody was still to the fact that it was quiet. Nobody said a word. We still suspected that plane is going to get rocketed or mortared or shot down. And hey, we're not out of this yet. And then when it finally did take off, and the captain came over and said, hey, we have just passed beyond South Vietnam airspace, there was just a collective cheer, from everybody, and smiles and back clapping, hey, we made it, and so on. And then everybody just sat back on their own, and maybe thought of their own memories. And those last couple of days were stressful as hell, because you still thought there was a chance you were going to get killed, and after all, it was drummed into your head for months that you're going to die there, and here we're not out of the country yet. But it was a very somber flight. This one going home took us through Japan, Anchorage, Alaska, and then into, I forget what base it's at, but up in Washington State, where they got us out. But it was the end of an adventure, and everybody was wasted. Everybody was kind of like beat up mentally, and there was no jovial discussions or carrying on like there was going over. It was a different group of people. We had been beat up for a year, and now finally we're going home. We're glad it's over with, but a much more somber ride and quiet ride home than it was going over.
When your plane landed in Washington, did you have any of the experiences that some vets have of the protesters and that sort of thing?
We had heard about it. When we landed, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. It was raining, and we had to walk probably a quarter of a mile from our plane to the terminal. There were some signs that said, thank you, welcome home, that kind of thing. And we went inside. They gave us new uniforms, new boots, all our ribbons, fed us a steak dinner, and gave us our travel vouchers. And then from there, it was to board a bus to take us to the Tacoma, Washington, I believe, airport. And just as the bus was coming to the outer gate, that's where all the protesters were. I mean, it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and these guys were all there with signs and
Wow.
throwing tomatoes at the bus and stuff like that. And it was, wow, this is unreal, that this is going on. But and same thing at the airport. Once we pulled up to the airport, at that time you could go into the terminals, so there were a lot of these guys in the terminals catcalling and so on. But once I got on a plane, I didn't see any of that. I mean, we had people buying us drinks. The stewardesses were bringing us drinks. We flew from there to Chicago. 90% of the group got off in Chicago. The other 10% was going to Detroit, where we were landing. And I mean, it was a jovial celebration time that, hey, we're going home. It's finally over and so forth. Everybody swore to keep in touch with each other, but nobody did. It was funny when I got home. Guys that I hung out with prior to going into the service, some didn't even know I was in a service, even though I had shorter hair than everybody else.
Wow.
But when they found out I was in Vietnam, there was a bunch of finger pointing and so on, etc. And we parted ways at that point. But I was surprised that within a year and a half, they fell to the level that they did, because they never experienced that. We were kind of all good friends, and then all of a sudden, because I served and came home, I was the outcast now. Nobody wanted to do anything with me, which was okay for me. I finally got over it. Back in the day, a lot of businesses would not hire you because Vietnam vets had a moniker, so to speak, and hey, they were all mentally screwed up. They were all dope addicts. They drank a lot, they're drunks and blah, blah, blah. So nobody wanted to hire you. So a lot of us, we buried the point in our resumes that we were even in the service. Fortunately, in my case, when I left the company that I was at, which was an automotive supplier, they were governed by federal law to hold my position open until I returned. So when I returned, I knew I was going back to the same old job I had. But fortunately, this personnel director that was there, he was probably in his mid-60s, but he was also I can't remember what there was a certain term for him, a group he belonged to. He had a ring and everything. Mason. He was a Mason. And he looked beyond all that stuff, and he saw that I was in a leadership position and so forth. And he offered me a supervisor's job on the spot. So I didn't have to go back to my old position. I could go to my old department and be a supervisor over the people I used to work with. And that was the start of my management responsibilities until I retired.
How about April 75 when South Vietnam falls, Saigon falls? Were you paying much attention to that when that happened?
Yeah, it was like a knife to the heart. Jesus, after everything we did and all the people that died over there, it really wasn't. Back in 75 when the war ended, it kind of like bolstered what I thought would happen anyway. The American presidents left. We weren't there to fight their war anymore, and there was just no way that they could go ahead and support that. But here you find out years later that had they had the support from the government as far as monies, weapons, and things of that nature that they were promised. And the government, the new government came and stopped all that. They might have continued on for several more years.
Mm.
But if you don't have the equipment that you need to fight a war, you're not going to win it.
So are you among the vets then who feel that the US kind of turned its back on an ally by not providing it with more supplies in 73, 74, 75?
Yeah, the government, not the US.
Beginning of the discussion, you said that you joined the Army because you felt like you had something that you wanted to prove to your dad, who had been in the Polish Army during the Second World War and had spent 5 years as a prisoner of war. Do you feel like you proved something?
Yeah, that proved that I could survive, as he survived those 6 years in a POW camp.
Yeah. Did you and your dad after the war, did you ever sort of share war stories? Of course, the war you're in is radically different from World War II, and then he's a prisoner of war. So these are very, very different circumstances. But did you share stories as, sort of soldier to soldier?
He would tell me the stories of his time as a POW, and what had happened and what they had to do and so forth. And I would add, the things that we went through in the jungle, and the different ailments that we had and so forth. And but I never did get into detail with him, and he never did with me beyond that. It was kind of like, my boy, you're home, you survived. I've got you for now on, until you're married and you leave. But yeah, you did it. So he takes all kind of pictures of me in my uniform, and he sends them to his family in Europe, and it's a big celebration. But yeah, I think I proved what I wanted to him, that and he even told me when I came home, you left as my boy and my son, but you came back as a man.